I had been engaged for 6 hours when I found out what the ring was for. It was in my bag. Not the ring, the contract. 12 pages Stefan had slid across the table that afternoon while he rubbed my shoulders and said, "You're too smart for your own good. Just initial it." I'd initialed it. Then, at the party, between the toast and the second glass, I'd read Clause 9. Share vesting conditional upon solemnization of marriage. 41% of my dead father's company. Moving. On the day I said yes. Stefan kissed my temple. 10 minutes. Business. He was a bad liar. That was supposed to be the safe thing about him. I counted to 60 and followed him down the quay with my heels in my hand. The boathouse had a lamp burning in the loft that nobody should have lit. I heard her laugh before I saw her. She signed it? This afternoon, Stefan. Prenup, transfer, all of it. She thinks it's tax structuring. And she believed you. She's an accountant, Julia. She believes paper. My phone buzzed in my hand. I went absolutely still. 300 people up the quay, and every one of them suddenly very far away. The lamp didn't move. He hadn't heard. I killed the screen, put my heels back on, climbed 3 stairs so the wood creaked. "Do you need a witness on page 9?" I said. "Or was one signature enough?" Silence, the good kind. Stefan came to the rail with his shirt open, and his face did something I'd never seen it do. Not shame. Arithmetic. "Vesna, it isn't—" "Don't." I looked past him. She was beautiful the way a knife is beautiful, and in no hurry to button anything. "Julia Faro, you broker freight for the Brenner Consortium." Her eyebrows went up. "You've read my file." "I've read everyone's file. It's what I was hired to do, before he decided it was cheaper to marry me." "Vesna," Stefan said, "go back inside." Go back inside. Not, "I'm sorry," not, "let me explain." He was already telling me where to stand. "Yes," I said, "I think I will." I walked back up the quay in a 2,000 euro dress with salt on the hem and my father's company burning a hole in my bag. And on the terrace, alone, one hand on the stone rail, his father was watching me come. Andreas Drakos didn't ask what had happened. He'd been watching that boathouse all night. "Took you long enough," he said. "How long have you known?" 11 days. I set my glass down harder than I meant to. 11! I don't move on suspicion. I moved when I had proof. Gray eyes went over my face like he was reading a cargo manifest. Tuesday. "And you let me stand in there and take a toast." "I let you find it yourself." No apology anywhere in him. "If I'd told you, you'd have doubted me. You'd have gone to him. He'd have talked, you'd have half believed him, and you'd have carried that half for the rest of your life." He wasn't wrong. That was the part I hated. So it was a kindness. No, it was efficient. He put an unlit cigarette back in his pocket. "Don't confuse the two with me. It'll save us both time." Inside, somebody started tapping a glass for a speech. "Your son is about to get engaged in front of 300 witnesses," I said. "My son is about to hand a Milanese consortium the North Key through a woman on their payroll." Bored, almost. "The engagement is the cheapest thing that happens tonight." "How long do you have?" 9 days. Then Brenner has enough signatures to force the harbor vote." 9 days. The glass tapped again. A voice called Stefan's name, then mine. I took off the ring. Slowly, because I wanted to feel every millimeter of it leaving. I put it in Andreas Drakos' palm and closed his fingers over it, and I didn't let go of his hand. "What happens to me?" I said. "That depends what you want." "And if I want him ruined?" He looked down at our hands, then at me. "Then we'd have something to discuss." Somewhere behind us, 300 people started to applaud a wedding that was not going to happen. "Good," I said. "Marry me." He didn't answer for 11 seconds. I counted. "Say that again." "Tomorrow, 7 a.m., your house. I'll bring the reason." He was in the kitchen making his own coffee, sleeves rolled, which surprised me more than the 2 men who'd searched me at the gate. "You slept," he said. 4 hours. I made them count." I put the folder down. Clause 9 ties Stefan's shares to the ceremony. No wedding, no shares. His lawyer got greedy. "So there's no wedding." "There has to be a wedding!" He stopped pouring. "Brenner doesn't need Stefan. They need a Dracos who can sign a birth license." I opened the folder. "Your charter gives the head of the family spouse a seat on the harbor board, not the son, the spouse. Your wife held it 19 years and nobody ever took the clause out." "You've read my articles." "I've read your everything. You hired me to." I looked up. "Give me the seat. In 9 days, I'll hand you the name of every man of yours they've bought. And Stefan loses the only thing he's ever had, which is being your son first." Andreas set down the pot and came around the counter. He didn't touch me. He stood close enough that I had to decide, consciously, not to move. "You don't know what you're walking into." "I do." "My wife died in a car meant for me." His voice never lifted. That was the frightening part. "The women in this house get the one thing men like Brenner can't take from me, so they take it from her instead." "Then I'll be hard to take." "Everyone's hard to take. Until they aren't." "I audited a Calabrian shipping trust at 24, I said. 3 colleagues were reassigned. 1 got a bullet through his kitchen window. I filed the report on time." Something moved in his jaw. "Why?" he said. "The real reason, not the paperwork." "Because for 8 years I've watched your family eat my city," I said. "And last night your son ate the last thing my father left me. I'd rather sit at your table than under it." He looked at me a long moment. Then he took his son's ring out of his pocket. He'd carried it all night, and dropped it in the bin. "Terms," he said. "You live here. You go nowhere without Matteo. You never lie to me, and I never lie to you. And when I say get in the car, you get in the car, and we argue afterwards." Counter. "I don't sign anything I haven't read." I held his eyes. "That includes you." "Agreed. And this is business." "For now," he said. 11 days to the ceremony. I moved in with 2 suitcases and my father's harbor pilot compass. By the second morning, the men were calling me Senora. I hated it and didn't correct them, because correcting them would have told them something. He gave me an office facing the water and 11 years of books, not the clean ones. "You're actually giving me these." "You asked for the door. I opened the door." He was already leaving. "Nothing on paper leaves that room." We met at strange hours. 1 a.m. at the fridge, both reaching for the same water. 6 a.m. on the terrace, him counting the fishing boats out like a man doing inventory on his own city. On the 4th night, he took the tablet out of my hands and set it face down. "Sit." I sat. He sat 1 seat away, which I noticed, and pretended not to. "Ask me," he said. "You've been circling it 3 days." "Why let them call you the harbor master? It's theater. You hate theater." "My father loved it. By the end, he was so in love with the story of himself, he couldn't hear anything else. He gave the North Key to a man who'd been selling him out for 2 years because the man called him a king." "And you keep the name." "I keep the name so they have their king." A glance sideways. "And I keep myself somewhere else, where I can hear." "That's lonely." "Yes." He lifted his hand, stopped it halfway, put it back on the arm of the chair. "Go to bed, Vesna." "That's not an answer." "No," Andrea said. "It's a mercy. Take it." I went back to the office instead because I am not good at mercy, and I pulled the archive for a container that had been bothering me for 2 days. A 40-foot box, berth 4, logged in and out 11 hours apart with a weight variance of 140 kilos. I found the pilot who'd brought that ship in through the Bora, Josip Kral, my father. He fell from the North Quay ladder that same night, 8 years ago. Blood alcohol reading that made the inquest 31 minutes long. He hadn't touched a drink in 19 years. I printed nothing, wrote nothing, memorized everything, and went to find Andreas in the courtyard. He took one look at me and dismissed 2 men with a movement of his hand so small I nearly missed it. "Say it." 3rd of October, berth 4. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a story. His face just closed like a door in winter. "Who gave you that date?" "Nobody gave me anything. I read it." My voice held. "There's a 9-minute gap in the gate log. 1 camera feed missing from an otherwise perfect archive, and the pilot who died that night has a daughter standing in your courtyard, in your dead wife's house. Vesna, was it you?" "No." "Then who?" And Andreas Dracos, who had not hesitated once in front of me, hesitated. "Ask me in a week." "No, that was the deal. I'm not lying to you. I'm asking you to wait." "Why?" "Because if I tell you tonight, you'll do something tonight," he said. "And I need you alive on the 11th. My eyes burned. I refused to let it go further than that. "He brought the big Greek freighters in through the Bora when nobody else would take them," I said. "He taught me to read a chart before I could read a book. And they wrote drunk on his file, and my mother heard it in a courtroom." Andreas raised his hand. This time he finished the movement. Thumb along my cheekbone, once, careful as a man diffusing something. "He was a good man," he said. "I know. I was there." Behind us on the drive, a phone started ringing and didn't stop. The North Warehouse was on fire. It burned 6 hours and took 11,000 tons with it. The Bora came off the karst at 90 an hour and made it unfightable. That wasn't luck. Someone had read a forecast. At dawn, a car came down the Key Road and didn't slow. I registered it late. He didn't. I was behind a steel bollard with his hand flat between my shoulder blades and his body between me and the road before the window came down. 3 shots, sparks off the container, gone. Then just the sea and my own breathing, very loud. "You're not hit." Not a question. Hands on my arms, fast, impersonal, absolutely thorough. "No. You?" "No. Get in the car." I got in the car. "That was a message," he said, watching the road. "If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead." "What's the message?" "Marry her and we burn the rest," which means someone in my house is talking. "Stefan." Stefan hasn't got the nerve to burn a warehouse. No, but Julia has, and Stefan has a mouth. I turned in the seat. Tell me about my father. You said you were there. Light, dark, light through a tunnel. Tomorrow. Tonight. Vesna. I have been shot at once, set on fire once, and lied to for 8 years, all before breakfast. My voice cracked exactly once, and I hated it. You said no lies. So either that was true at 7 in the morning, or it was never true at all. Pick. The car came out of the tunnel. Not in the house, Andrea said. Too many ears. Then where? The boat. An old wooden Riva at the end of the private basin. Immaculate. The kind of thing men keep because it belonged to somebody. He didn't start the engine. We sat in it with the water knocking the hull. The container was mine, he said. It came in under a fertilizer manifest. It wasn't fertilizer. Weapons. For a buyer I'd refused twice. My brother Milos took the order behind my back. He'd been doing it a year. Eyes on the water. Your father read the drafts, knew the weight was wrong, and he was the kind of man who wrote things down. He filed the discrepancy report. At 11:40 p.m., he was dead by 10 past midnight. The water knocked. Say the rest. Milos put him off the ladder. He came to me at 4 in the morning and told me he'd solved a problem. And you took him out on this boat 11 days later, Andrea said, and came back alone. The sun was coming up over the Slovene hills. I remember thinking how obscene it was that it looked beautiful. You killed your brother. Yes. For my father. For my brother's stupidity. For your father. And because I let it happen by not watching him. He turned. Don't make it clean, Vesna. I don't get to be clean. 8 years rearranged themselves in about 4 seconds. The scholarship, I said slowly. Bocconi. The trust that paid my mother's mortgage and closed itself the month I graduated. Yes. You never said. What was I going to say? And there, finally, something raw came off him. I'm the reason there was a container on your father's ship. Here's a check. You'd have thrown it in my face and been right. Then you hired me, 4 months ago, to audit you. I'd been reading about you for 8 years, he said. I wanted to see who he'd made. I don't know exactly how I crossed that boat. I know my hands were in his collar and his were at my waist, and there was nothing gentle in it from either of us. 8 years of grief and 11 days of held breath and a car on the quay at dawn. He broke it, forehead to mine, absolutely still. Vesna. Don't tell me it's business. It stopped being business, he said, on the terrace. I stepped back anyway, because I am my father's daughter and I don't sign anything I haven't read twice. Then we do this properly, I said. Thursday. And you keep your hands to yourself until the ink's dry, or I'll assume you're managing me. He almost smiled. Understood. 11 meters up the quay, in the dark between 2 containers, a phone camera was taking photographs of both of us. Neither of us saw it. 9 minutes in a municipal office on a Thursday. 2 of his men as witnesses. I wore gray. He wore black. The reception was the war. He held it in the same room as the engagement. Same view, same 300 people. Because Andreas Dracos does not hide, and because I asked him to. Stefan came, obviously. Beautiful suit, Julia on his arm, and he made it 40 minutes before the wine started talking. You couldn't wait. Loud enough for the nearest 30. 11 days, my father. 12, since the boathouse. His face went white. Careful, Andreas said. He didn't raise his voice. The room went quiet anyway. You're talking to my wife. She's a bookkeeper. She's the second signature on every birth license in this port as of 8 o'clock this morning. Andreas turned to face the room, unhurried, and 300 people understood something at the same moment. Anyone with business, bring it to either of us. It's the same answer. Julia's smile didn't move a millimeter. That's how I knew we'd hurt her. She found me by the windows later with 2 glasses and the friendly face of a woman about to open a vein. You're better than I expected. You're exactly what I expected. Do you know what Brenner offered him? Not money, relevance. She sipped. Stefan spent 29 years being a chair his father hasn't sat in yet. And you gave him permission to stop waiting. You should understand that, Signora. You didn't marry a man. You walked into a boardroom and took a seat. Yes, I said. The difference is, I told him first. Something flickered. Then she turned her phone towards me. A photograph. A boat. 2 people who were not being careful. Wednesday, Julia said pleasantly. The day before your wedding. Isn't it funny how fast a woman can go from victim to motive? She walked away before I could take the glass out of her hand. Much later, when the last car had gone down the hill, he found me on the terrace with my shoes off. You didn't drink, he said. Neither did you. He held out his hand. I looked at it for a second, at him, at the whole impossible architecture of 12 days. This is where I could still keep it a business arrangement, I said. Yes. I don't want to. I know. I took his hand. The terrace doors closed, and the sea kept going, and that's all anyone needs to know. At 2 a.m., his phone lit up on the nightstand, a number I'd flagged 11 days earlier, in a ledger, in a column marked Legal Retainers. 2 words. She's in. I didn't wake him. I photographed the screen and went back to the books. 16 days. He was up at 5. I was up at 4:30, and he'd bring coffee and read over my shoulder, and neither of us would say anything for an hour, and I have never been happier in my life, which should have frightened me more than it did. The number belonged to Ruggieri, the family lawyer. 9 years of service and a Slovenian consultancy with 3 clients and no employees. I found 8 more like him, 2 dockmasters, a customs inspector, 4 of Andreas's own, and on day 16 I found the 9th, and the room went cold. Colonel Ranieri, Guardia di Finanza, financial crimes. The man who had closed my father's inquest in 31 minutes. 3 years on Brenner's payroll. I ran to find Andreas. I never got there. Matteo met me at the bottom of the stairs, phone still in his hand. Signora, they've taken him. What? 20 minutes ago. 12 of them. Warrant signed at 6. On what? Conspiracy. Arms trafficking. His jaw was tight. They have the 3rd of October. The container, the gate logs, a signed statement. The floor tilted very gently. Signed by who? Matteo looked at the floor. By his son. Here's what a woman married 16 days is supposed to do. Cry, call a lawyer, wait. Here's what I did. I locked myself in that office for 11 hours and read. Because Stefan had made the same mistake he'd made with the prenup, the same one he'd made his entire life, he was greedy and he was fast. He'd handed the Guardia the 3rd of October file, the whole file, which meant he had handed a bot colonel a document with that colonel's own signature on the inquest of a murder, closed in 31 minutes while sitting on Brenner's money. Andreas had buried that file for 8 years to protect a dead pilot's family. His son dug it up to bury him, and put a loaded gun in my hand doing it. I called Matteo at midnight. 3 things: a meeting with Ranieri, alone, a meeting with Brenner's finance director, not Julia, the man who signs, and Stefan's phone records, 6 months. Signora, Andreas said, Andreas is in a cell in Via Tor Bandena, and I am the second signature on every license in this port. A pause on the line. Signora, if you're wrong about the colonel, then I'm a widow with an excellent filing system, I said. Get me the meetings, Matteo. He chose a public cafe on the Canal Grande at 10 in the morning, which told me everything. Frightened men love witnesses. 60, neat, ordered for both of us without asking. Signora Dracos, my condolences on your marriage. Colonel, your signature is on my father's death certificate. Many signatures are on many certificates. Josip Kral, 3rd of October, closed in 31 minutes, on a blood sample with no chain of custody log. I checked the archive. It isn't missing. It was never made. I laid 1 page between the coffees. Which is interesting, because you took your first Brenner payment 14 days earlier. Tourists went past. Water slapped the stone. He set his cup down very carefully. You should be extremely careful. I've been careful for 11 hours, and it's exhausting. So let's be direct. I leaned in. You've charged my husband using a file that convicts you. Every hour it sits in evidence. It's a bomb under your pension. And you can't withdraw it now without explaining why. And you can't release it without hanging him. No, but I don't have to release it. I only have to send it to the Milan prosecutor as an anonymous note about irregularities in an 8-year-old inquest. I smiled. Then it isn't my document. It's theirs. And it's Tuesday. His hand was not quite steady. What do you want? You'll discover this afternoon that the arrest was procedurally defective. You'll be embarrassed. Andreas Dracos walks tomorrow morning. I stood. Then on Thursday, you and I have a second conversation about Brenner, in which you are extremely talkative. You're asking me to burn a consortium. I'm telling you which fire you're already standing in. I put a note on the table for coffee I hadn't touched. You gave my father 31 minutes, Colonel. I've given you a day and a half. I think that's generous. He called me at 4 the next morning. He wasn't the only one who called. They came Thursday night, because men like that always come to take the thing in person, so everyone can watch them holding it. Warehouse 6, empty since the fire. Sodium lights, salt wind, Bora rising. Carl went at a folding table, 4 men behind him, Julia at his shoulder, and Stefan beside her, looking like a man who'd been promised a kingdom and had just noticed nobody was standing near him. I walked 100 meters of concrete alone, in flat shoes. Signora Dracos, you came without your husband. My husband was released at 9 this morning. A very good silence. Julia's eyes went to Stefan and away again. I'm here because you're a finance director and I'm an auditor, I said. And we're the only two people in this building who understand what's actually happening. One folder on the table. Your northern route runs through 4 holding vehicles. All 4 are funded from the same account in Vaduz. That account has been taking Dracos birth revenue for 19 months through a broker's commission. I opened it. Which means every euro you've moved through this port has touched money your own compliance committee believes is clean. Went red. His face didn't move, but he read. That's the diagnosis. Here's the threat. At 8 this morning, Colonel Ranieri filed an internal request for full transaction history on that account. It's time-stamped. It can't be pulled. Julia said, Ranieri is ours. Ranieri was yours. I looked at her for the first time. Now he's a man with an 8-year-old inquest around his neck and 48 hours of survival instinct. You bought a policeman, Julia. You should have bought a coward with better options. The Bora came through the door and moved everything not tied down. So, your route's compromised, your inside man's compromised, and your legal entry, I turned to Stefan, signed a statement to the financial police admitting personal knowledge of an arms shipment under his own name. Back to Went. Would you seat that man on a board? Nobody said anything. Went closed the folder. Stefan, wait outside. What? Outside. 4 seconds. That was all it took. Stefan Dracos looked around a room of people who had finished needing him. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. What do you want, Senora? Went asked. The North Key isn't for sale. It never will be. Send one more man with a match, and Vaduz goes to Milan and Vienna in the same week. I closed my bag. In exchange, this meeting didn't happen, and your name isn't in the note. You have until Monday to be out of my port. Your port. My port, I said. Then I turned my back on 9 men and walked 100 meters of concrete without hurrying, because hurrying is how they know. Andreas was standing in the doorway with the wind in his coat. He'd been there the whole time. Of course he had. You didn't come in? No. Why? Because you didn't need me to, he said. And every man in that room had to see it. Outside, Stefan was sitting on a bollard in the dark, waiting for someone to tell him what he was now. Andreas walked past him without stopping. I didn't. Say it, Stefan said. Whatever it is, say it and go. I was going to marry you, I said. That's all. I thought I was going to be happy in a small way forever, and you sold it for a chair. He looked up at me, and for 1 second he was 29 and lost. He'll do it to you too, you know. He does it to everyone. No, I said. He tried to hand me the door. You're the only one who ever tried to sell me the room. He left Trieste 11 days later, Rome, then Lisbon. Andreas paid for the apartment, never said so. I found it in the accounts because I find everything in the accounts, and I didn't mention it because there are things a man is allowed to keep. Julia Faro's name surfaced in a Milanese indictment in March. Wentz didn't. I keep my word. That's the entire product. Ranieri retired on medical grounds and gave 400 pages to a prosecutor named Belandi. And on a wet Tuesday in April, A correction was published in the Register concerning the death of a harbor pilot on the 3rd of October, 8 years earlier. 22 words. My mother read it 11 times. That night, he came out onto the terrace and put a folder in my lap. What's this? Dissolution, annulment, then a clean division. Adriatica Crawl comes back to you whole, plus the North Key licenses and 40% of the legitimate company. He sat down, 1 seat away, the way he had the first night. Sign it and you walk out with more than you came in with, and nobody in Europe ever touches you again. I read every page, 20 minutes. He waited without a word, which is one of 11,000 things about him. I picked up the pen. I want to be honest about that. I picked it up and I held it over the line. And for about 4 seconds, I thought about a life where nobody ever shot at me on a key at dawn. Why? I said. Because you married me on a Thursday to win a war, and the war's over. He watched the water. And I've seen what happens to a woman who stays in this house because she can't find the door. So there it is. It's open. It stays open. I closed the folder. No. He turned his head. Not because I can't leave. I dropped the papers on the table. Because I read it twice, and it's beneath us both. You wrote yourself out of every clause. Section 4 hands me the key and leaves you carrying the whole that deuce exposure alone. Yes. Yes, I repeated. You built me a lifeboat and got in the water. Vesna, I'm not finished. I turned to face him. My counter. I stay. Not as a wife on paper, as the second signature, permanently, written into the articles, unremovable. I take the board seat in my own name. My father's company keeps my father's name. And every legitimate cent of this business runs through my books, which means in 6 years, I will have made you clean, whether you enjoy it or not. The corner of his mouth moved. That's the business half, I said. Here's the rest. I took his hand. His fingers closed over mine instantly without deciding to, which told me everything. I chose you on a terrace when I had nothing. I'm choosing you again now that I have everything, and that's the only version that counts. I held on. But understand me. I'm not staying because you protected me. I'm staying because I like the woman I am in this house, and I built her myself. He was quiet a long moment. Then Andreas Dracos, who did not hurry for anything, lifted my hand and pressed his mouth to my knuckles like a man swearing something in a language he'd stopped believing in. Terms accepted. I'll have them drafted by Friday. Of course you will. And Andreas? I stood, picked up the dissolution papers, and dropped them off the rail into 100 meters of dark. Don't ever offer me the door again. I know exactly where it is. I looked out at the water. I put the lock on it myself. Below us, the port burned all the way out to the breakwater, and somewhere down there, a pilot boat was going out to bring a big Greek freighter in through the dark, the way my father used to. I watched it the whole way in. Then I went inside, to my house, to my husband, on my terms. The end. If you liked this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? I love seeing how far these stories travel. See you in the next one.